Good morning to each one. Welcome you here. Glad that you are here. Greet you in the name of our risen Savior. I did have a little testimony, and part of Calvin's prayer, I guess, reflects on that. When Jesse led this song, I need the prayers of those I love. That was very true Friday, and it wasn't because my soul was being tempted or where that first verse went, but it was because I had toothache this week. To a level that I don't know if I've had before or not. Friday was the worst, and I'm just like, I'm supposed to study tomorrow, and if it's like this, I can't even concentrate, let alone try to preach Sunday. So as different of the brothers contacted me via messages on phone or whatever for other things, then I would just pass that prayer request on. So there was 3 or 4 of them that were praying with me, and I think my family, and the Lord has provided very graciously. And if I don't get too excited and bite too hard on the wrong tooth today while I'm preaching, I think I'll be fine. So thank God for that, and just glad for that prayer support that we can have. So last Sunday, I preached about having a proper perspective on wealth. And I think that's maybe more important than today's message. I don't know. It's hard to slice and dice all of that. But I think according to some scriptures, we can do right things with our wealth, but if our heart isn't right, then it still isn't good enough. So a proper perspective on wealth is very important. I think today's message is also important. I have heard that the 2 most dangerous things to preach about is about people's children and about people's money. So here goes. All right, we had a homework assignment. I had given you a homework assignment. 1 Chronicles 29, and that story about giving. And I am just going to open it up. If you have any quick comments on either principles that you picked up or something that challenged you about giving, some insight that you had, just speak up. Speak very clearly, loudly, so people can hear you. But yeah, it's open. It's your part of the sermon right now. What did you pick up from that story?
Willingness to share.
A willingness to share. Okay.
Also picked up, all this is the Lord's.
Yes, very, very key point, I thought. We are only giving back what is your own. Okay. Being intentional. David planned ahead. I don't know for how many years. I should have checked that. Did you check that out, Brother Steve?
Well, I know that they used the blueprints that Samuel and David put together. So it happened a long time before he died.
Very interesting. Yes, intentional.
More blessed to give than to receive.
Okay.
People's hearts were after God. We've recently been reading about the time of Israel's history when Ahab was king. And I just had to imagine what it would have been like if Ahab, for some strange reason, had been building a temple. I don't think it would have had anywhere close to the same kind of outcome because their hearts weren't after God.
Yeah, good point. I hadn't thought about that. Anyone else?
When we all work together, how happy we'll be.
Yeah, it was. The people rejoiced. After everything was done, they all rejoiced together. And it was a working together.
I thought it was interesting that they were willing to give even though they might not see the product.
I hadn't thought about that part. Investing. Very good. I guess a few of the things that really got me thinking was in verse 2, David said, I have prepared with all my might for the house of God. What kind of picture does that give you? With all my might. Then he follows up in verse 3, because, he says why? Because I set my affection to the house of my God. Remember how we ended, how the sermon ended last week was basically on the point. Maybe it wasn't quite at the end, but where your treasure is, there's your heart. There's this correlation between treasure and heart, and we can't separate it. It's obvious where David's treasure was. His affection was set on the house of God. He actually wanted to build that temple. He wanted to build that house of God, and God said, no, that's not in your place. I want a man of peace to build it. That'll be your son. He said, well, then I'm going to do what I can. And like Brother Steve brought out, for years in the planning, collecting wealth, those were probably the two things that got my attention. And then the fact that Brother Lyle mentioned, you notice this in verse 11, 12, 14, and 16, this thought of all that is in the earth and in the heaven is yours, and we're only giving it back. That's all. We're just giving back what is already yours. I love stories. That's how I learn, is by looking at a story and picking out things like that. So that was very impacting for me. So the title for today's message is The Proper Use of Our Wealth. And I'll just tell you right at the start, I'm not going to be able to cover everything that I even hope to. There's so many things in the scripture that actually give us practical advice on wealth. So what is the proper use of our wealth? I have a question for you. How many of you own something? And before you answer, I mean in the fact that you took money, you paid for it, and now that item is yours. How many of you own something? Yeah, there's a lot of us. Okay. So when I own something, it is mine. I can keep it, I can use it whatever manner I want to, I can sell it, I can throw it away. If I'm feeling generous, I can loan it to you. It's mine. And so don't tell me what I can and can't do with it, right? Sometimes we feel like that. But let's think about those possessions. So you said you paid for it. So where do you get the money to pay for it? Well, I worked for it, right? Okay, so we're employed. Most of us are employed by someone. So would you have a job if your employer wouldn't have decided to start a business, take that venture, and if it weren't for your coworkers, would you even be able to, that small part of, in my case, building a cabinet, if I wouldn't have guys in the finish room, nobody would want the cabinets that I build, because raw white wood cabinets, just raw, it's not very nice. So how about the co-workers around you? Well, let's go back even farther. Who taught you how to work? Maybe that reaches back to your dad, to your mom, or maybe one of the first bosses you had. Let's go even farther. Who gave you strength? Who gave you life? Who gave you the health, the ability to work? See where I'm getting at? Some of those possessions that we have, and they're mine, and we hold them like this. When we really start looking at it, I think of that verse where Paul said, what do you have that wasn't given to you? It's not that much that we can claim to just be just mine. And he wasn't necessarily, in the context, wasn't necessarily about material things so much, but I think the principle applies. Gives us a little different perspective on our possessions. Think about, we'll go to a safe example. When little children are fighting for a toy, they're not holding it with open hands, are they? No, this is mine. You can't have it. I'm playing. They're not holding it like that, are they? They're like, no, and they've got to hold on to it, and everything depends on it. They're going to hang on to it. It's going to be mine because I had it first. What if, is that a picture of what we do? Is it mine? Maybe we shouldn't call them possessions. Maybe we should call them just holdings. I have these things. And it doesn't really matter so much what we call them. It matters how we have them. But if we can hold our material things in open hands, because when you think about it, when you're offering something to someone, it's often on an open hand, isn't it? It's not like, you can have this. People don't, you know what I mean. So, again, we can call it what we want. We can call it our possessions if our perspective is right. If our perspective is right, I think our use will follow through in a proper manner. So, probably the first question that comes up and that we think about. I don't know if I should say I often hear it discussed, but I have, is the question, well, should I tithe? Well, if you study into tithing, it was a Gentile practice. If you look into history, and I didn't study this a lot, but it was in place before God set up the laws for his people. In fact, the first mention is found, you'll probably remember, in Genesis 14, when Abram went out to rescue Lot, regained all the people and all the possessions of Lot and several of the other kings of the surrounding towns there, got everything back, and then he met the king of Salem, Melchizedek, and he ended up paying tithes to him. And if you look into history, tithing was actually a thing that was in place where people would give a tenth back to, if they were a farmer, back to the owner of the land or to their king if they were subject to someone, if they were serving someone, or to a priest. So it was something that was in place, but then God incorporated that principle also later on in Leviticus. You'll find it, where Leviticus 27, I believe, is maybe where it's first mentioned, the tithe of the land. If you plant seeds or the fruit of your trees, either one is mentioned, and then in the next couple verses it talks about even from your flocks, that a tithe, a tenth would be given. Numbers 18, and you can find other scriptures where the law is given. So it seems again that the tithe was instituted. The two lessons that I kind of got out of it is that reminder that we one of the things that we picked up from the story in 1 Chronicles there, this is not ours. This is God. This is God's land. In fact, very interesting, Leviticus 27 is where you find the laws about tithing. You go back 2 chapters into Leviticus 25, and God is talking about the ownership of the land, and he's telling them, you're not supposed to sell the land permanently forever to someone else out of your tribe or to a foreigner. And here's the reason why. He said, because the land is mine. So tithing, in the Israelites giving a tithe back of their first fruits of their crops, it was a reminder that, yeah, I'm just possessing things here. I'm just a steward. I'm not actually the owner in the real sense. God is the owner. So I think that is one of the purposes of why a tithe was given, is to remind us that we are only stewards. And then it was also to stir up a gratefulness because of the abundance that we have. And as I thought about this, there were several different areas where God just convicted me, and some of the ways was in perspectives, how I viewed things. Some ways was in my giving, and so Lena and I would discuss different things about this. It's just been a very good study for me. You know, selfishness, greediness just really creeps in the back door sometimes, doesn't it? And we're just not aware of it. And I find it in different seasons of my life. There's sort of these sets of years early in parenting where it seems like there's just a black hole where your paycheck drops into, and you just, and maybe you're not able to give as much at that time. We'll talk about some of that later. What should we do? So coming back to the tithing, just being grateful for the abundance. And that's one thing that I was aware of. Even though we still have some monthly payments that need to be made, we still have an abundance. We have more than what we need, and so we can give. And so that should stir up a gratefulness within me. And so tithing can actually be a reminder of that. So I think that's and there may be others, but that's the two things that I settled on that I believe God had in mind for the tithe, that it would stir up in his people. Well, you say, we're not under the Old Testament law anymore. So tithing was then. And that's right. But be careful what you wish for, because when Jesus, think about some other areas of the law where Jesus took the Old Testament teaching, then he said, this is what the Old Testament said, this is what the law said, but I say unto you, and then he fleshed it out, and it usually goes deeper in meaning and in one sense requires more, doesn't it? He goes down into, and he did teach about wealth. He would have taught on the perspective. So maybe if we say, well, the tithe was an Old Testament thing, maybe we're indicting ourselves and calling us to a higher standard of giving. Not sure. Matthew 6, on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talked about doing alms. And it basically means doing something good for the poor. It can mean a donation, a gift. And it's sort of an assumption there. He just said, when you do your alms, and then he proceeded to tell us how to do it. He didn't even say, you're supposed to give alms. And of course, he was talking to Old Testament setting, and yet, I think as we read on through the New Testament, we just know that giving is a part of being a born-again Christian, don't we? It's just part of giving back. It's part of being grateful people. We realize we are humbled by the unspeakable gift of God, things that he has blessed us with, salvation first of all, and then beyond that. And so it's just the response of a redeemed heart. Well, let's turn to 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians 8, and if you're familiar with this letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church there, almost all of chapter 8 and 9 has to do with the church's giving and helping out the poor church in Jerusalem. They had been persecuted. There were several earthquakes that have happened. There was crop failures, and the church was in need in Jerusalem. And so some of these churches had heard about that need, and they had decided they were going to get money together, and I think it was through the teaching of Paul. And we simply don't have time to read all of this. I would encourage you just to take the time this afternoon and just read the whole chapter, because we're just going to pick out some verses to read here. But that's the background. The church in Jerusalem needed assistance. So let's start 2 Corinthians 8. We'll start reading in verse 7. 2 Corinthians 8, verse 7. Therefore, as ye abound in everything, in faith, in utterance, and knowledge, and in all diligence, and in your love to us, see that ye abound in this grace also. What grace? The grace of giving. Being able to help out others. So verse 8, I speak not by commandment, by occasion of the forwardness of others, and to prove the sincerity of your love. Whoa. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that, though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that ye through his poverty might be rich. And herein I give my advice, for this is expedient or profitable for you, who have begun before not only to do, but also to be forward a year ago. Now therefore perform the doing of it, that as there was a readiness to will, so there may be a performance also out of that which ye have. For if there be first a willing mind, it is accepted according to that a man hath, and not according to that he hath not. Did you catch that? It depends on your attitude more than the amount. So verse 13, for I mean not that other men be eased and ye burdened, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may be a supply for their want, that their abundance also may be a supply for your want, that there may be equality. As it is written, he that had gathered much had nothing over, and he that had gathered little had no lack. We'll quit reading there. That last verse is referring to manna. Remember the story of manna? They were told about how much to gather every day. Some people just didn't believe Moses, and they gathered more I don't know if they were lazy or if they were not trusting. Could have been either way. But they gathered more and they had leftovers. Guess what? The leftovers got stinky and got maggots. It didn't work. So maybe he's saying if we try to save too much for ourselves, our wealth will get stinky and have maggots. Now, probably not literally, but maybe in our soul. Now, let's jump on over. Like I said, we don't have time to read all of this, but let's jump over into chapter 9. Begin reading in verse 6 there. 2 Corinthians 9, verse 6. But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Every man according as he purposeth in his heart. Here's some specific commands on how to give. Every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity or by compulsion, for God loveth a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that ye, always having all sufficiency in all things, may abound to every good work. As it is written, he hath dispersed abroad, he hath given to the poor, his righteousness remaineth forever. Now he that ministereth seed to the sower, both minister bread for your food, and multiply your seed sown, and increase the fruits of your righteousness, being enriched in everything to all bountifulness, which causeth through us thanksgiving to God. For the administration of this service, the giving, not only supplieth the want of the saints, but is abundant also by many thanksgivings unto God. While by the experiment of this ministration they glorify God for your professed subjection unto the gospel of Christ, and for your liberal distribution unto them and unto all men, and by their prayer for you, which long after you for the exceeding grace of God in you. Thanks be unto God for his unspeakable gift. He draws our mind there, that closing verse, he draws our mind back again to God, the giver of every perfect and good gift. That unspeakable gift means it's simply indescribable. The gift of Jesus Christ to us. So we owe everything back to God. That's the bottom line. Well, where do we start? We're talking about tithing. Let's go back into chapter 8, just touching on a few things. And verse 12, for if there be first a willing mind. Now again, the two sermons, the perspective and the use, it's so hard to keep them separated because we just kind of keep going back. And this is a perspective again. We have to have a willing mind. And basically he says, well, that's over in verse 7 of the next chapter, chapter 9. So let him give not grudgingly or of necessity, because I have to. Oh, there's this need again, and just, we have to help him out. Ugh. I can put less down my house payment this month because of the need over here. No, not that at all. He says you need to be able to give with a willing mind. And then he talks about the amount. He says it's accepted according to that a man hath, not according to that he hath not. Maybe you're sitting here this morning, you're thinking, well, I'm in that time of life, or maybe there's certain needs, maybe there has been a sickness, or I don't know what those situations are. I'm thinking of situations where you're not short on money because you just frivolously spend it and you have no self-control, and I'm not talking about that situation. That's something that needs to change in your life too, proper use of money. I'm talking about you're responsible in paying your bills, and school tuition is high, and all those things. And it feels like, I can't give as much as I want to. There's other ways of giving also. You can serve, you can meet needs, doing physical things, actually going and doing a job for someone. There's so many ways. But here he's talking specifically about the Lord knows if you have a willing mind and you would love to give. And he says it's accepted according to whatever you have. Think about Jesus when he was watching the widow lady. She put in just a few pennies is all it was. But it was enough. In fact, Jesus said it was more. The way he was looking at it, it was more than what the rich men were just putting into just tons of money apparently. And he said it was more what she had given because they were giving of just out of their abundance. So a willing heart is very necessary. But jumping back over to chapter 9, verse 7. Every man according as he purposeth in his heart. That purposeth means to choose for oneself before another thing. The way I understand that is, just in very practical terms, when I get my check at the end of the week, what's the first thing I should consider? Every man according as he purposeth, choosing that first thing. Giving needs to be the first thing I look at. Now, what percentage are you going to give? I'll touch on that just a little bit more later. But you purpose. You decide. I think it should be systematic. That was mentioned earlier when we looked at, or it was planned for, sort of that idea of systematic. Doing it on a regular basis. But that part, I didn't realize that it actually included that in the meaning. That purposeth that's the first thing that I look for. When you start saying, okay, so much of this check is going to go for house payment, so much for insurance, or however you do it, that first line, I think, should just be simply, what can I afford to give to God? And it should be according to a plan that you have. Because it does say, as you choose in your heart, as you purpose in your heart, so let him give, him or her. First Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, Paul was giving us some practical advice. He said, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God prospereth him, that there be no gatherings when I come. Seems to indicate a weekly thing, systematic, regularity. Lay it up on the first day of the week. That's when we meet for church, right? And I think the church just provides us a good, safe avenue of giving. We get, maybe we don't get as much in the mail as we used to now that so many things are online, but so many organizations that want your money. And if you check into a lot of them, it sounds like they're doing a good work, but by the time they pay all their workers and whatever else, there's very little that goes to the actual need. Now, I think the church here, working through our local church, you can rest assured that your money is going to where the need is. So, still talking about this thing, should I tithe or shouldn't I? Well, we're not necessarily answering that question at this point yet, but he's saying it should be according to purpose. Don't be like some. I think I've heard somebody say this. I hope it was just facetiously, But, well, Jesus said, don't let your right hand know don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so I'm just going to put money in the offering. Guess what? I know exactly where my $1 bills are and where the 20s are. I don't think that's what he had in mind. I know it's not what he had in mind. But I think we should plan, because there's times when you feel joyful and you feel willing to give, and there's times when you don't, or else maybe it's just me. There's times when, like I said, I find that maybe it's financial needs, maybe it's just simply selfishness comes in and settles into my heart, and I don't feel like giving, and I'd rather just keep a little more. So I have to have a plan in place. That's how I've found it, and I think these scriptures would indicate that also. Now, if we go back to chapter 8, I know I'm jumping back and forth here, but let's look at verse 13 and 14 again in chapter 8. He says, for I mean not that other men be eased and ye burdened. It simply means that Paul's saying, I don't mean for other people to be relaxed, and just be able to live easily and you're just supporting them. He says, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may be a supply for their want, and that their abundance may also be a supply for your want. And now these wants are not like we look at wants today. It means the need. So according to our terminology, the meaning of words changes at times. So these wants that he's talking about is a literal need. And it just reminded me of and I know I've mentioned this before, but one of my Belizean friends that I had gone over to his house and asked him to loan, I don't know, was it a tool or what it was. And I just asked him, I said, why are you guys so willing to just just loan things out. It's just like, well, oh, sure, almost no thought to it. And he just said, well, he said, today I have what you need. Tomorrow you have what I need. It just makes sense, and it's scriptural. That's exactly what Paul was saying here. But he uses the terms equality, and that's kind of a buzzword for today. If you look up the original meaning with my study helps, it has the idea of, one of the implied meanings is equity. Well, what's the difference between equality and equity? And looking at needs here. And if I can pick on a few people, hopefully you don't mind, I'm going to pick on you, Jake. You're a bit taller than I am, right? So let's say you and me and I see Jonathan Zimmerman. Let's say us three are trying to look over a fence. And Jake's there, and he's no problem seeing over it. Now, if I stand on my tiptoes, I can maybe see over it, and poor little Jonathan's just down here. So equality would say we get a 5-gallon bucket, and all of us get a 5-gallon bucket to stand on. Well, now Jake's above the fence, and I can easily see over it, and poor Jonathan's still down here. Equity says Jake has an abundance of height, so he takes his 5-gallon bucket and gives it to where the need is, to Jonathan. Now Jonathan has 2 buckets to stand on. Now he can see over. Now we're all looking over the fence. See the difference between equality and equity? Paul isn't saying that we're going to take the 5 richest men from church here, and we're going to start passing out money to starting at the poorest member. We're going to do assessment on everybody, and so now everybody has $25,000 in the bank. No, he's saying you have an abundance right now, so you can help this church in Jerusalem that has a need. And maybe next year, when you're in need, or whenever it happens, then they will respond back. That is what he's talking about here. I mean not that other men be eased and ye burdened, but by an equality. That's how we try to do that. That's why the church is a safe way of meeting needs, because we have in place deacons that are observing, watching for needs, and they will try to give to the need as is needed, when it's needed, that kind of thing. And sometimes, depending on the situation, maybe there is a literal financial need, and maybe there has been misuse of funds, or there some teaching is needed. So I don't think we do well to just throw money at every need, just indiscriminately. But maybe we give money, but then we also provide some mentoring in helping along with learning how to better handle those funds. And there's accountability that comes with that. So again, it's just maybe that's touching more on the next point of where do I give, getting a little bit ahead of myself. So Paul is saying that need is given. And so maybe that also helps us in deciding how much to give. There's times been many times here that you, church, have done so well in when we've presented needs above our regular offerings, and you just give and give. And I am so blessed by that, and I just pray that God would bless you for that, because there's no way of I can't bless you for that. But so Paul is teaching, basically the bottom line is that when we have an abundance, and like I said, yes, we still have, we have our house payments, that kind of thing, but we have more than enough. We still have an abundance. I can still afford to give. So we give out of that abundance as is needed, when it's needed. So how much to give? We still haven't really decided. Do we need to tithe or don't we? Every man according as he purposeth in his heart. So you're going to have to decide. You really are going to have to decide. And it's something you can pray about. If you're married, you talk about it with your wife. Or ask some others for advice. If you're not sure, well, am I supposed to tithe or not? But I believe that was a principle that God set up in the Old Testament. And if you really don't know where to start, I think that's a very safe place to start. It's a good place to start, is to give 10%. And so do I Do I tithe out of my net? Do I tithe out of my gross? It's interesting if you talk to people about that. Varied opinions. And again, every man according as he purposeth. But I think once you purpose and you decide, then you need to stay there and do that. I know which way. I've done it for quite a few years, and I try to stay with that same plan. It helps keep my heart honest. It really does. And it helps even expose sometimes when there is that selfishness going on in my heart. Because there really isn't teaching in the New Testament that says, or not that I've picked up, I may be wrong, you can correct me, that actually points to saying, yes, give a tithe. But I think it is a safe place to start. 2 Corinthians 8, verse 7, it said, therefore, as ye abound in everything. It has the idea of flourishing. And he mentions their faith, their utterance, their knowledge, all diligence, and in your love. He says, see that ye abound and flourish. Grow in this grace also. And that's something that convicted me. I have for many years just more or less given that same percentage. And I thought, wait a minute. The Apostle Paul is saying we're supposed to grow in our giving. I think that's what he's saying. Years ago, I read a story, Mover of Men and Mountains, and it's the story of R.G. Letourneau, and he didn't start out as a big businessman, but he ended up as a big businessman. Huge earth-moving equipment. Was way ahead of his time and just invented machine after machine, and he made money hand over fist. And you know what he's living on? He lived on 10%. He gave 90% back to the Lord. You don't think that takes some trust, some faith? We say, well, he was making a lot of money. Well, it's all in that percentage. It's where he was living. Just put yourself. I don't think God calls all of us to do that, okay? I'm not putting that on you. But I think we need to read some of those stories sometimes to be jogged out of our little comfortable place. Because honestly, sometimes it just really takes trust in God to really give when there's a need and we feel like, well, I really can't. And to just say, I'm going to anyhow, it takes trust. And there are different promises that God gives. Verse 6, he which soweth sparingly, you're going to reap sparingly. You sow bountifully, you're going to reap bountifully. Now, is it always in the financial that God pays back? I give 50 and he gives me 50 back. I don't think it's like that. God doesn't always work like that. He can choose to do that. Sometimes he does. But there's other blessings that come. But he does reward. And sometimes it's just that joy. I think you mentioned that, Katie. That joy that the people had after they gave. They just rejoiced as a church together. They rejoiced when they saw themselves and their leaders working together and their hearts set on the kingdom. And so there's reward in that. Just reminds me of a verse. I don't have it written down. It's not in my notes, but I came across it. I've been aware of it. In Proverbs, it talks that a good man will leave an inheritance to his children's children. And I've told my wife I'm not sure that I'm a good man. I'm not sure that I'm going to have money left over for my grandchildren. But you know what? There's other inheritances to pass on beyond dollars. And I reflect on my great-grandpa Schrock, a very godly man from what I knew of him and the testimony that I heard of him. He was a janitor at the, the high school right behind the Essen House. He was the janitor there for many years in his later years in life. And they knew that if they couldn't find him anywhere else, they could go down to the mechanical room, and he'd be sitting there on his chair reading a Bible there if he had his other work done. It wasn't that he was sloughing off, but that's where he spent his other time. And he was friends with the high school students as this old grandpa. He was friends with high school students there. What a testimony. And I reflect on that. I don't know that I've received any inheritance passed on down from him financially, money-wise, but I sure have received a godly inheritance. So let's make sure. I mean, it's nice if we can pass on an inheritance to our children, our children's children, I guess. That's nice. That maybe will help them out of a tight spot financially. But I think it's way more important. There's other treasures that we can pass on. Well, just a few more things here. In Proverbs 3, 9, and 10, it says, honor the Lord with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. It says, honor the Lord with your substance. That has the idea of your wealth, your possessions, your holdings. Let's go back to that word. Things that we hold, things that we have. So we're supposed to honor him with that. And then it says, and with the first fruits of all thine increase. I just heard last week, I think it was, of one of the ladies sitting here, and I'm just not even going to look so I don't pick out, nobody knows who I'm talking about necessarily, that literally followed this. The first fruits of her garden, should we give back by giving it to others? And I was challenged by that. Just taking a verse, something like this, literal. Are we willing to honor God with the first fruits of all our increase? There's some of my increases that I just want to say, well, this was just a gift to me, and so I don't really have to tithe on this. See how that it exposes what's sitting inside of our heart. God help us as we see that to change by his grace. Let's honor him with what we have. So where or to whom do we give? Galatians 6:10 says, as we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men. But then he says, especially unto them who are of the household of faith. Romans 12:13, he says, distributing to the necessity of saints. I think our first priority should be to our brothers and sisters, to the local church, and then to the broader church. I think that is where our responsibility is. And again, it would point back to, giving in our monthly offerings, giving as other needs come up. So I think our first responsibility is to other believers. And then maybe there's, as we're aware of a way of impacting the community, reaching out, honoring God with our substance. If we know, that there's some need in maybe one of our coworkers, maybe one of our neighbors, there's ways to reach out. There's ways to assist with that also. Another way of where do we give, to who do we give? If you look in 1 Timothy 5, there's some very clear instructions for the church on how to give to the widows. But in the middle of that, it talks about some of our responsibility as children and grandchildren to our parents and our grandparents. Now, it uses the word nephews in verse 4, but it does mean grandchildren, if you look at it. So it's a bit of an unfortunate translation there. And I'll just read that verse for you. But if any widow have children or nephews, grandchildren, let them learn first to show piety at home and to requite their parents. That means to repay their parents, for that is good and acceptable before God. And then on down, verse that we've often heard, but if any provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. I think we have a responsibility. If there is a widow in our family, or sometimes there's other situations that are similar or other needs. In fact, later on he says that if you have, I'm not sure which verse it is. I don't know if I can find it. There it is, verse 16. If any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged, that it may relieve them that are widows indeed. It's my responsibility as a family member, if mom has needs, or whoever it is in my family has needs, he's saying it's my responsibility to help take care of that, I would say as much as we can, so that the church isn't overburdened, so that they can help those who are really our widows, have no one to help them, that kind of thing. So there are instructions given to us as children and grandchildren. So, and that depends on what the needs are. Maybe your grandparents don't have needs, and maybe they're well set financially. Maybe they just need you to stop in and visit them, and some of those things. So the Bible does give us some specific instructions, and I guess I'll just stop there. There's a couple other areas I would have loved to go into, but I think we have enough to think about. Search the scriptures. There's instructions there for us. But I think the bottom line is we need to remember that we're only stewards. We're not this. We're just stewards. We're just holding these things, and we're looking to honor God with our substance, the material things he's given to us. So let's give back to him with a grateful heart, and then he receives honor and thanks through that. Just reading again David's prayer there in 1 Chronicles 29, he said, after all the money was given, all the gold, all the silver, he says, but who am I and what is my people that we should be able to offer so willingly after this sort? For all things come of thee, and of thine own have we given thee. Let's kneel for prayer. Father, we recognize that you have blessed us abundantly. And I pray, God, that you would bless the church for the many times they have just dug in and supplied for a need as it was presented, Lord. I pray you would bless them. But, Lord, help us to grow, as the Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthian church. Help us to grow in this grace and to do even more and to honor you more with our good things, Lord, and grow in the grace of giving. Lord, help us to be responsible and intentional with our abundance. But Lord, most of all, may our hearts be fixed on you. May we be set on serving your kingdom and doing the things that you want us to, that would expand your kingdom